The Butterfly in Amber by Kate Forsyth. Book review. So this is part of my scripted review series in which I take an old review that I wrote on my weblog 10 years ago and try and make a YouTube video out of it for whatever that may or may not be worth. In this case, this was a book that I read when I was living in Australia and studying at the University of Melbourne. While I was studying there, I was doing a graduate degree in applied linguistics and feeling a little bit burnt out by reading all the technical literature required by the course. So I was going to the university library to try and pick up some light reading, and I discovered after about half a year that the university library actually had an audiobook section where you could check out audiobooks. They were on CD back then. And you could bring them home, listen to them, and then bring them back. And I absolutely love audiobooks. The main reason is it's a very nice way to get in reading without sacrificing any extra time. So, I'll have the audiobook on while I'm at the gym, I'll have the audiobook on while I'm going for a walk, I'll have the audiobook on while I'm doing some exercises or cleaning the apartment or getting ready for bed or any of that stuff. So for that reason, I tend to be a lot less picky about what I'll listen to on audiobook because I don't view it as time lost. I view it as just, extra time. Which it goes a long way to explaining why I read this book. I'm not sure I would have picked this up if it was in print, but because it was an audiobook and because it was at the university library, if it's vaguely interesting, I'll pick it up. Now, when I discovered this in the university library, it was actually, I believe, maybe in their children's literature section. And it is a young adult book. I think the publishers market it as 9 to 18. 18 is probably at the high end of that. It's probably, 9 to 14 might be a good range. Well, yeah, a good ideal range. Of course, I enjoyed it when I was in my 30s, so there's really no cutoff end here. And I have no shame when it comes to reading children's books. I've read and reviewed a number of them on this channel so far. The Harry Potter series, the Dark Materials series, the Lemony Snicket book, Princess and the Goblin. I've read and reviewed a lot of children's literature on this YouTube channel, and I don't think there's any need to feel ashamed of it, especially if it's as light reading or escapist reading. Now, it was very evident just from the artwork on the cover of this that it was some sort of fantasy series. It had some of the mystical air, and there wasn't any magic on the cover, but you just got that sense. It was also pink, pastel colors. There was a pink ribbon border and flowers around it, which looked like it might be aimed more at the female market than at the male market. But I was still intrigued, and the cover art gave sort of an air of mystery or something fantastical. So it looked like it could be interesting. And then, as I turned over the back cover to read the description, I found that this was historical fiction set during the time of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, shortly after the English Civil War. Now, this has always been one of the periods of history that's fascinated me. I've not read up in depth about it, although I've read around it. And I've talked about it a few times on this channel, like reviewing the BBC series The Devil's Whore, which is also about Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans in the English Civil War. So I decided to check out this book. Now, once I got the book, I got home and I got on the internet to try and research this book, and there was nothing on the internet about this book, which I thought was surprising because I just always assumed that in this day and age, there's tons of information about everything on the internet, especially, for a book like this, which was published by a major publisher, Pan Macmillan, Australia, in which they made it into an audiobook, and the audiobook is of very good quality. I mean, I'll get around to nitpicking my problems with the actual plot of the book later. But as far as the voice acting and the delivery of the audiobook, it's very good. You know, it's professional quality, and I think on the high end of professional quality. The woman they got to do it is really giving her all. She's doing, you know, slightly different voices for each characters and doing a lot of emotion, and it's really well done. So it was surprising to me that there's just so little information on the internet about this book. Actually, I searched it again just now to see if that was still true, because this was 10 years ago. I think there's a bit more information now. There's a bit more of a discussion on the Goodreads page for this book, which I don't remember finding 10 years ago. There's still no discussion on the Amazon page, just as there was 10 years ago. There's, I think, a couple reviews have been published on people's weblogs, which by the dates of those I can tell they had been since I read this book 10 years ago. But yeah, by and large, not a lot of information, and I'm wondering, this was published by Pan Macmillan, Australia. I wonder if this never got released outside of Australia, or if it was just for the Australian market. And again, I was in Australia when I got this from the University of Melbourne Library, so maybe that explains why there's not a lot of information about this. Anyways, from what I was able to piece together, this book is the sixth and final book in what a larger series called The Chain of Charms. So this is the last book in the series, which, you know, I have this little theory that it is impossible to read a fantasy book without committing yourself to a series, which is one of the reasons I don't read more fantasy than I do. I consider myself a fan of the genre. I've always been fascinated by fantasy, and I love the escapism that it offers. But it is so hard to be a casual fan of it. You know, you go into the bookstore and you're like, oh, this looks interesting, and you're like, oh, it's book 3 of 15. Okay, well, now I've got to track down the other 15 books if I want to get into this. And I mean, yes, I do understand that we as fantasy fans, part of what attracts us to the genre is the ability to immerse yourself in this world, and long series lend themselves to that immersion. In this case, however, this is a much shorter book. I did it as audiobook, and it's only 4 CDs. And if you listen to a lot of audiobooks, it's probably all on MP3s nowadays, but if you remember audiobooks from the days when they used to be on CDs, 4 CDs is like nothing. You know, quite routinely I'll go to the library and get on an audiobook and it'll be like 20 CDs. So now I know this is for kids, but still, according to the internet, the printed page version is 288 pages long. So I'm thinking they could have easily put all 6 books maybe in one binding, or, you know, one audiobook. I mean, what makes this so frustrating is the University of Melbourne Library only had this book in the series. So, and you know, I went and I checked their paper copies, and I tried my best to track it down. I even, while I was listening to this book on audiobook, wandered into a couple of bookstores in Melbourne and looked, and yeah, this series was not on their shelves. I think according to the internet, this series was released in 2006, 2007. I was in Melbourne in 2010, and that was enough time for this series to completely disappear from the shelves. Which, you know, I guess maybe these young adult series do have a very short shelf life as new books. But it just indicates the frustration of printing them all up as separate books. Because, you know, for like 1 year they're all on the shelf, and then they're out of print, they're no longer on the shelf, and you're at the library or used bookstore and you find this book, and it, you know, it's book like six, it's book 6 of the series, and you're like, well, where are the other 5 books? So, and it's not like this is one of those series where each book is a separate adventure. This is clearly just one continuous story that's been chopped up into 6 books. So I was at a significant disadvantage coming into book 6 of the series. I read it anyways because it was on audiobook, and I figured, why not? And like I said at the beginning, you don't lose anything by listening to an audiobook. But yeah, would have been preferable if the whole story had been on one in one binding or on one audiobook. But I guess if you're only going to do one of them, you might as well do the ending, right? I mean, it could have been worse. I could have gotten like book 3 out of 6. So, this is the ending of the book. I think I was more or less able to catch on to what was happening throughout it, even without having read the previous books in the series. Although the last quarter of the book is just an emotional reunion with all the characters from what I assume are previous installments of the book. And so that last quarter of the book meant, was pretty boring to me because I'm like, well, who are these guys? I don't know who these guys are. I don't care. That part was boring. But the first 3/4 of the book, where they were wrapping up the plot, was mildly interesting. Now, the plot involves 2 gypsy children who are trying to rescue their family. Their family have been imprisoned by Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans. In order to do this, they first need to search and find all the lucky charms of their family. So it's one of those quest books, kind of like a video game where you gotta have to go and find all the magic items, and then once you have them together. And they're always talking about finding lucky charms and losing the lucky charms. Like, oh, we found another one of the lucky charms, or oh no, we've lost this lucky charm. Which, I grew up in the 1980s and watched a lot of TV and remember the Lucky Charms breakfast cereal commercials where there was this leprechaun who was always talking about finding Lucky Charms and losing Lucky Charms. And it seemed to me a little bit silly that this same language was going on in the book. I don't know, maybe those same breakfast commercials weren't as popular in Australia during the 1980s. I don't know. Kate Forsyth, I think, is about 10 years older than me, so maybe there's a generational thing going on here. But I just thought, oh, come on, this is like a parody of a breakfast cereal commercial. If you can put that aside, though, the story does work, more or less. It is one of those stories, though, the children get into a lot of tight spots, where there's some sort of danger and they've got to get out of it. And just about every time, they get out of it due to their magical lucky charms. There will be some sort of miraculous coincidence or act of nature, and the children will say, it was the lucky charms that, gave us that good luck to get out of it. Which, personally, I don't like those kind of stories where there's always some sort of like miraculous supernatural intervention. I like stories when the characters themselves have to use their own wits or their own resources to get themselves out of danger. But to be fair, this story is very upfront with what it's doing. I mean, it's not like you're reading the story and you're like, oh, cheap, they got out of it with the Lucky Charms. You know all along that the whole purpose of these Lucky Charms is to give them good luck and to get out of danger. So everybody knows what they're getting in for. Now, Oliver Cromwell, mentioned my historical interest in him was one of the main reasons for giving this book a go in the first place. He never actually appears in this book. I don't know if he appears in any of the previous installments or not. And when I say appear, I mean he never actually makes an on-stage appearance. But he's very much a presence in this book. All the characters are talking about him and talking about his illness and his impending death. It's a little bit difficult to tease out the politics of this book coming into the 6th part of it, but it appears to be sympathetic to the royalist side. Children are on the royalist side. They talk favorably about people on the royalist side, like I think the Duke Ormond. Sorry, where are my notes here? And the Countess Dysart. Yeah, personally, I am on the anti-royalist side. Now, I don't want to defend Oliver Cromwell, because Oliver Cromwell was a tyrant near the end, and he's a complicated man. He's difficult to defend. Also, the Puritans come off as bad guys in this book because they're they come out as religious zealots and they come off as puritanical, for lack of a better word, which, you know, I suppose they were, really. I mean, the Puritans did have their dark side as well. But that being said, I think the author tips her hand a little bit to being a little bit too pro-royalist, because in the afterword to this book, she praises Charles II a little bit too much. She said that Charles II came back and he worked well with Parliament, and he had much less power and was much more restrained than Oliver Cromwell was. And I think it's true, actually, that Oliver Cromwell had more power as dictator than Charles II had as king. I'm not sure that's to Charles II's credit. In other words, I'm not sure that's because Charles II was just naturally such a moderate and reasonable guy. I think that's because the historical circumstances restrained him somewhat. He inherited a position that had less power. And it is absolutely not true that he worked very well with Parliament throughout the whole reign. I mean, look up Charles II on Wikipedia. He dissolved Parliament near the end of his reign and just ruled without it. This is called his absolute monarch phase. I mean, that's what it's called. So that was a little bit of a gloss, I thought. But these are minor complaints, and I am just kind of complaining about the afterword of the book. On the whole, I could still enjoy the story, even though I got the sense maybe that the author had more royalist sympathies than I do. The story is a nice mix of historical fiction with an element of fantasy. Now, the element of fantasy comes through with these lucky charms that the children are collecting. And also, I'm counting this as kind of fantastical. They're accompanied by a lot of tame animals. There's a dog and a monkey and a bear who follow them around and are their friends. And then there's a horse that shows up at the end and seems, though I'm assuming the horse was a larger part of the previous books. You know, it's kind of a little silly, but it's all good fun. The afterword at the book, I mentioned there was an afterword when they talk about Charles II's legacy. There's also, in the author's afterword, an interesting discussion of whether or not Oliver Cromwell was poisoned at the end of his life. The author talks about maybe some of the evidence that he might have been poisoned. And then there's an interesting historical afterword about Oliver Cromwell's head. Now, I never knew this, but after Oliver Cromwell's head was parted from its body, it was put on a pike, and then the pike blew down in a storm one day, and the head apparently ended up in various people's collections over the years, where Oliver Cromwell's mummified head was passed around from person to person, or it pops up at various different places before it was finally rediscovered again and buried. Now again, fact-checking this on Wikipedia, the accuracy of some of this is debated, which is not the sense you get in the author's afterword. The author's afterword here passes it off as if this were historical fact. Wikipedia indicates maybe some of this might have been rumors or urban legends or something like that, but at the very least, there are these stories about Oliver Cromwell's head, and I never knew about them before, and I was made aware of them from the author's afterword to this book. So I thought that was interesting. On the whole, well, this was all right. I'm not a huge fan of this book. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it either. I found it interesting enough for what it was, and because it was an audiobook and because I got it from the library, I'm not going to complain too much about it. I think it's an interesting idea to mix elements of fantasy with historical fiction. And I don't know, I have this little theory maybe that in the old days most fantasy was historical fiction. I mean, you think about all the old fantastic epics of antiquity, the Trojan War or the King Arthur cycle, or in China, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is this huge epic fantasy that was loosely based on real ancient kingdoms, and on and on and on. It seems like most of the ancient fantasy was kind of based on his history, or it was kind of mythological version of history. And I'm wondering, because nowadays if you pick up a fantasy book, it's all about it's a completely different world or a completely different universe. And I'm wondering if that starts with Tolkien. Tolkien and his Middle-earth stuff. Was Tolkien the first person to say, look, this isn't ancient Europe, this isn't like the medieval times, this is just a completely different universe that these stories are happening in. I think maybe Tolkien was the first one to do that, although I'm not an expert on this stuff. So, somebody let me know in the comments if you know better. But I get the sense maybe Tolkien was the first one to do this, and I think maybe something was lost there, because I do think combining fantasy with historical fiction can be really interesting, and maybe we're missing out on a lot of very interesting interpretations of historical fiction by saying that always putting the fantasy in alternative worlds. Now, as I said that, actually, I am aware that there has been some historical fiction recently that has tried to do that. And if you have any good recommendations, let me know. What makes me a little bit uncomfortable about this book, however, is the magical element in this book. It's not elves, it's not dwarves, it's gypsies. Gypsies are the magical and fantastic elements in this book. And gypsies are, they're a real ethnic group. I suppose you're not supposed to call them gypsies nowadays because that term is out of date. But they were called gypsies back then, and it's a real ethnic group. Now, this book is a very sympathetic portrayal of the gypsy people, and it highlights a persecution that they did suffer under puritanical England. So the book is highlighting a historical injustice that the historical gypsies did suffer. And yet, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with what seems to be a stereotypical portrayal of the gypsies here, with the magic charms and the magic element and stuff like that. It's not a bad portrayal. It just seems to be reinforcing a stereotype, maybe. But I'm cautious about this because I don't want to be the arbiter of what's racist and what's not. Or maybe racist is a strong word. What's politically correct these days and what's not. I would be very interested in other people's opinions, and particularly the descendants of the gypsies, or the modern day ethnic group. If any of them are watching, how do they feel about this particular portrayal? I'm slightly uncomfortable with it, but maybe it's, I don't know. I'm going to pass that question off to you guys. Let me know in the comments what you think.